The eighth Sunday after Trinity, O God, whose never failing providence orders all things in heaven and earth, we humbly beseech thee to put away from us all hurtful things, and to give us those things which will be profitable for us, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We're on hymn 631 under the Holy Scriptures, Book of Books, our people's strength, statesmen, teachers, heroes, treasure, bringing freedom, spreading truth, shedding light that none can measure. Wisdom comes to those who know thee. All the best we have, we owe thee. Well, we return to Professor Roland Harrison on Isaiah in the International Standard Biblical Encyclopedia for the overview. To come back to the canonical text of Isaiah. So we start with an analysis and content. There are 6 general divisions of the book. 1 through 12 are prophecies concerning Judah and Jerusalem, closing with promises of restoration and thanksgiving. 13 to 23 are oracles of judgment, salvation, for the most part concerning foreign nations. 24 to 27, the Lord's world judgment and the redemption of Israel. 28 to 35, this is the 4th section, a cycle of prophetic warnings against the alliance with Egypt, closing with the prophecy of Edom and the promise of Israel's ransom. 36 to 69, history, prophecy, and song intermingled, serving as an appendix to 1 to 35, an introduction to 40 to 66. 40 to 66, prophecies concerning comfort and salvation, and also the future glory awaiting Israel. By examining in detail these several divisions, we can trace better the prophet's thought, and 1 through 12 reveal Judah's social sins, its political entanglements. Chapter 1 is an introduction in which the prophet strikes the chief notes of his entire book: thoughtlessness, formalism in worship, pardon, and judgment. Chapters 2 to 4 contain 3 distinct pictures of Zion, its exaltation and its present idolatry, its eventual purification. Chapter 5 contains an argument of Judah and Jerusalem composed of 3 parts: a parable of the Lord's vineyard, a series of 6 woes pronounced against insatiable greed, daring defiance against the Lord, confusion of moral distinctions, political self-conceit, and misdirected heroism, an announcement of imminent judgment. The Assyrian is on the way, and there will be no escape. Chapter 6 recounts the prophet's inaugural vision and commission. It is really an apologetic, standing as it does after the prophet's denunciation of his contemporaries. Judah's sins are hopeless. They are becoming spiritually insensible. They have eyes, but they cannot see. Only judgment can avail. The righteous judgment of a forgotten God awakens them. A holy seed, however, still existed in Israel's stock. In chapters 7 to 12, Isaiah appears in the role of a practical statesman. He warns Ahaz against political entanglements with Assyria. Section 7 through 9:7 is a prophecy of Emmanuel, history, and prediction being intermingled. It describes the Syro-Ephraimitic uprising about 734 BC, when Pekah of Israel and Rezin of Damascus, in attempting to defend themselves against the Assyrians, demanded that Ahaz of Jerusalem should become their ally. But Ahaz preferred the friendship of Assyria and refused to enter into alliance with them. In order to defend himself, he applied to Syria for assistance, sending ambassadors with many treasures, with royal and sacred, to bribe Tiglath-Pileser. It was at this juncture that Isaiah, the Lord's bidding, expostulating with Ahaz concerning this fatal step he was to take, and as a practical statesman warned Ahaz, the king of no faith, that the only path of safety lay in loyalty to the Lord and avoidance of foreign entanglements. When, however, the prophet's message of promise and salvation found no welcome, he committed it to his disciples, bound up and sealed for the future use, assuring his hearers that to them the child was born and the son was given, in whose days the empire of David would be established on the basis of justice and righteousness. The messianic scion was the ground of the prophetic hope. This hope, though unprecedented, he thus early in the ministry committed, written and sealed, to the inner circle of his disciples. The section 9:8 contains an announcement to Israel of accumulated wrath and impending ruin, with a refrain, 9:12. Here, in an artistic poem consisting of 4 strophes, the prophet describes the great calamities that the Lord has sent down upon Israel that have gone unheeded: foreign invasion, defeat in battle, anarchy, the impending captivity. Yet the Lord's judgments have been ignored. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. Divine discipline has failed. Only judgment remains. In 10:5-34, Assyria is declared to be an instrument of the Lord, the rod of the Lord's anger. In chapter 11 and 12, predict Israel's return from exile, including a vision of Messiah's reign of peace. For Isaiah's vision of the nation's future reached far beyond mere exile. To him, the downfall of Assyria was the signal of the commencement of a new era in Israel's history. Assyria has no future. Its downfall is fatal. Judah has a future. Its calamities are only disciplinary. An ideal prince will be raised up, whose advent all nature will rejoice, even dumb animals. The second great exodus will take place, for the Lord will set his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people from the 4 corners of the earth. In that day Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. On the contrary, the reunited nation, redeemed and occupying their rightful territory, shall sing a hymn of thanksgiving, proclaiming the salvation of the Lord to all the earth. Chapters 13-23 contain the oracles of judgment and salvation, for the most part concerning those foreign nations whose fortunes affected Judah and Jerusalem. They are grouped together by the editor as similar foreign oracles are Jeremiah 46-51 and Ezekiel 25-32. Isaiah's horizon was worldwide. First among the foreign prophecies stands the oracle concerning Babylon, which he predicts the utter destruction of the city and sings a dirge or taunt song over its fallen king. The king alluded to is almost beyond doubt an Assyrian, not a Babylonian, monarch of the 8th century. The brief prophecy following immediately in 14:24-27 concerning Assyria tacitly confirms this interpretation. Another brief oracle concerning Babylon describes the city as imminent. Both oracles stand or fall as genuine prophecies of Isaiah. Both seem to have been written from Jerusalem, cannot be said that either is unrelated in thought or language to Isaiah's age. Each foretells the doom to fall on Babylon at the hands of the Medes, and each describes the Israelites already in exile, but not necessarily all Israel. Section 14, 24 to 27 tells of the certain destruction of the Assyrian. The passage 14, 28 to 32 is an oracle concerning Philistia. Chapters 15 and 16 are ancient oracles against Moab, whose dirge-like meter resembles that of chapter 13 and 14. These oracles consist of two separate prophecies belonging to two different periods in Isaiah's ministry. The 3 points of particular interest in the oracles are the prophet's tender sympathy for Moab in her affliction. As Delitzsch says, there's no prophecy in the book of Isaiah in which the heart of the prophet is so painfully affected by what his mind sees and his mouth is obliged to prophesy. Moab's pathetic appeal for shelter from her foes, particularly the ground on which she urges it, namely the messianic hope that the Davidic dynasty shall always stand and be able to repulse its foes. The prophecy is an echo of 9, 5 through 7. The promise that a remnant of Moabs, though small, shall be saved. The prophet predicts that Moab, wearied of prayer to Chemosh in the high places, will seek the living God. The passage 17, 1 to 11 is an oracle concerning Damascus and Israel, in which Isaiah predicts the fate of the two allies, Syria and Ephraim, the Syro-Ephraimitic War of 737, with a promise that only scanty remnant will survive. Chapter 18 describes Ethiopia as in great excitement, sending ambassadors here and there, possibly all the way to Jerusalem, ostensibly seeking aid and making preparations for war. Assyria had already taken Damascus and Samaria, and consequently Egypt and Ethiopia were in fear of invasion. Isaiah bids the ambassadors to return home and quietly watch the Lord thwart Assyria's confident attempt to subjugate Judah. And he adds that when the Ethiopians have seen God's hand in the coming deliverance of Judah and Jerusalem, they will bring a present to the Lord, to his abode in Zion. Chapter 19. Okay. I'm not sure we're getting much beyond what we would get perspicuously in reading these chapters of 13 to 23, but let's just muscle our way along. Chapter 19, which is an oracle concerning Egypt, contains both a threat and a promise, and is one of Isaiah's most remarkable foreign messages. Egypt is smitten and thereby led to abandon its idols for the worship of the Lord. Still more remarkable, it is prophesied that the day of Egypt and Assyria will join Judah in a triple alliance of common worship to the Lord and blessing. Isaiah's missionary outlook here is remarkable. Chapter 20 describes Sargon's march against Egypt and Ethiopia, containing a brief symbolic prediction of Assyria's victory over Egypt and Ethiopia. By donning a captive's garb for 3 years, Isaiah attempts to teach the citizens of Jerusalem that the siege of Ashdod was but a means to an end in Sargon's plain campaign, and that it was sheer folly for the Egyptian party in Jerusalem. Chapter 22 concerns the foreign temper within the theocracy. It is composed of 2 parts. An oracle of the Valley of Vision, example Jerusalem, and a tirade against Shebna, the steward of the palace. Isaiah pauses, as it were, as his series of warnings to foreign nations to rebuke the foreign temper of the frivolous inhabitants of Jerusalem, and in particular Shebna, high official in government. The reckless and God-ignoring citizens of the capital are pictured as indulging themselves in hilarious eating and drinking when the enemy is even at the very moment standing before the gates of the city. And that will preach, won't it? The frivolous eating and drinking. Perhaps a Syrian by birth, quite possibly one of the Egyptian party whose policy was antagonistic to that of Isaiah and the king. Israel's prediction of Shebna's fall was evidently fulfilled. Chapter 3 concerns Tyre. This oracle, Isaiah predicts that Tyre shall be laid waste, its commercial glory humbled, its colonies made independent, and Tyre itself forgotten for 70 years. But after the end of 70 years, its trade will revive, its business prosperity will return, and it will dedicate its gains in merchandise as holy to the Lord. That's 13 to 23. Now we move on to the 24 to 27, where Isaiah emphasizes and tells of the Lord's world judgment issuing in the redemption of Israel. These prophecies are closely related to chapter 13 to 23. Express the same tender emotion as that in 15, 16, and sum up in one grand finale the prophet's oracles to Israel's neighbors. For religious importance, they stand second to none in the book of Isaiah, teaching the necessity of divine discipline and the glorious redemption awaiting the faithful in Israel. They are a spiritual commentary on the great Assyrian crisis of the 8th century. They are messages of salvation intended not for declamation, but for meditation, and were probably addressed more particularly to the prophet's inner circle of disciples. These characters partake of the nature of apocalypse, strictly speaking. However, they are prophecy, not apocalypse. No one ascends into heaven or talks with an angel, as in Daniel 7 or Revelation 4. They are apocalypse only in the sense that certain things are predicted as sure to come to pass. Isaiah was fond of this kind of prophecy. He frequently lifts the reader out of the sphere of mere history to paint the future of the distant future. In other words, he's got hope for the future. Something here for us to ponder. In chapter 24, the prophet announces a general judgment of the earth, the land of Judah, and the holy city collective, after which will be drawn a better day. The prophet fancies he hears the song of deliverance, but alas, we are premature. More judgment must follow. In chapter 25, the prophet transports himself to the period after the Assyrian catastrophe, and identifying himself with the redeemed, puts into their mouths songs of praise for their deliverance. Verses 6 through 8 describe the Lord's bountiful banquet on Mount Zion to all nations, who in keeping with 2 through 4 come up from Jerusalem. In 26, 1 to 19, Judah sings a song over Jerusalem, the impregnable city of God. The prophet taking again his stand with the redeemed remnant of the nation, vividly portrays their thankful trust in the Lord, who has been to them a veritable everlasting rock. With hope, he joyfully exclaims, "Let the Lord's dead ones live. Let Israel's dead bodies arise. This is the first clear statement of the resurrection in the Old Testament, but it is national and restricted to Israel. It is merely Isaiah's method of expressing a hope of the return of Israel's faithful ones from the captivity. In 26:20 to 27, the prophet shows that Israel's chastisements are temporary. He begins by exhorting his own people, his disciples, to continue a little longer in the solitude of prayer till God's wrath has shattered the world powers. He next predicts that the true vineyard of the Lord will henceforth be safely guarded against the briars and thorns of foreign invasion. And then, after showing that the Lord's chastisements of Israel were light compared with his judgments upon other nations, he promises that if Israel will only repent, the Lord will spare no pains. The prophet's fundamental standpoint in 24 to 27 is the same as that as 2 to 4, and 13 through 23. The prophet not infrequently throws himself forward into the remote future, oscillating between his own times and those of Israel's restoration. It is especially noteworthy how he sustains himself in long and continued transportation of himself to a period of Israel's redemption. He even studies to identify himself with the new Israel that will emerge out of the present chaos of political events. His visions of Israel's redemption carry him in ecstasy far away into the remote future, to a time when the nation's sufferings are all over, so that when he writes down what he saw in a vision, he describes it as a discipline that is past. For example, 25, 1 to 8, transported to the end of time, celebrates in a song what he saw, describes how the fall of the world empire is followed by the conversion of the heathen. In 26:8 and following, he looks back in the past from the standpoint of the redeemed in the last days, and tells how longingly Israel waited for the manifestation of God's righteousness, which has now taken place. While in 27:7 to 9, he places himself in the midst of the nation's sufferings, in full view of the glorious future, portrays how the Lord's dealing with Israel have not been punishment of wrath, but the discipline of love. This kind of apocalypse or prophecy was indeed to be expected from the beginning of the group of prophecies which are introduced with the word behold. Such a manner of introduction is peculiar to Israel, and of itself leads us to expect a message that is unique. The practical religious values of these prophecies to Israel's own age would be very great. There's something to be said there about looking to the future and kind of having ideals of what might be good for something, this, that, and the other to happen. We're trying to prognosticate and figure out what we do as Anglicans with all the confusions that we've got and sins. What we want the future to look like. Music and gladness we're wanting. And when the nation still clung to its idols, and the Assyrians' work of destruction was still incomplete, other calamities were sure to follow. It would certainly be comforting to know that the forgiveness was still possible, that the Lord was still the keeper of his vineyard, that his judgments were to last but for a moment. That though his people should be scattered, he would soon carefully gather them one by one, and they're precious. And in company with other nations, they would feast together on Mount Zion as the Lord's guests, 25. That Jerusalem should henceforth become the center of life and religion to all nations. Such faith in the Lord, such exhortations and songs and confessions of the dream seen in a vision, would be a source of rich spiritual comfort to the few suffering saints in Judah and Jerusalem, and a guiding star to the faithful disciples of the prophet's most inner circle. That raises the question about Isaiah and academic studies in the canon, and the men who are around him studying and reading and worshiping, and the sacrificial system was still ongoing in the Solomonic temple. Oh, to walk around those Isaiah and talk with him. Well, just open his book and read him. Chapters 28 to 35 contain a cycle of prophetic warnings against alliance with Egypt, closing with a prophecy concerning Edom and a prophecy of Israel's ransom. As in 5:8 to 23, the prophet indulges in a series of 6 woes. Woe to drunken, scoffing politicians, chapter 28. This is one of the great chapters of Isaiah's book. In the opening section, the prophet points in warning to the proud drunkards of Ephraim, whose crown, Samaria, is rapidly fading. He next turns to the scoffing politicians of Jerusalem, rebuking especially the bibulous priests who stumble in judgment, and the staggering prophets who err in vision. He closes with a most instructive parable from agriculture, teaching that God's judgments are not arbitrary, that as the husbandman does not plow and harrow his fields the whole year round, so God will not punish his people forever, and as the husband does not thresh all kinds of grain with equal severity, no more will God discipline his people beyond their deserts. Woe to the formalists in religion. Isaiah's second woe is pronounced upon Ariel, the altar hearth of God, Jerusalem, sacrificial center of Israel's worship of the Lord in Zion. But now, Zion's worship, wholly conventional, formal, and therefore insincere. It is learned by rote. Therefore, says Isaiah, the Lord is forced to do an extraordinary work among them in order to bring them back to a true knowledge of himself. Oh boy, for us prayer book guys, that's something we need to talk about as we envision the future. We say at morning prayer that give us that due sense of all thy mercies, that we may have an unfeigned thankfulness, and that we may show forth thy praise, not just with our lips, but in our lives, by offering up ourselves to thy service, and by walking before thee in holiness and righteousness all our days. Formalism is a real danger to us prayer book guys. We need it, and we do. We recognize the danger of it. Woe to those who hide their plans from God. What their plans are, which they are devising in secret, the prophet does not yet disclose. But he doubtless alludes to their intrigues with the Egyptians and their purpose to break faith with the Assyrians, to whom they were bound by treaty to pay annual tribute. Isaiah bravely remonstrates with them for supposing that any policy will succeed that excludes the counsel and wisdom of the Holy One. They are but clay. He is the potter. At this point, somewhat abruptly, Isaiah turns his face toward the messianic future. In a very little while, he says, Lebanon, which is now overrun by Assyria's army, shall become a fruitful field, and the blind and deaf, spiritually weak, shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. Woe to the pro-Egyptian party. Chapter 30. Isaiah's woe is directed against the rebellious politicians who stubbornly and now openly advocate making a league with Egypt. They have at length succeeded, apparently, in winning over the king to their side. An embassy is already on its way to Egypt, bearing across the desert of the Exodus rich treasures with which to purchase the friendship of their former oppressors. Isaiah now condemns what he can no longer prevent. Egypt is a Rahab who sits still, a mythological sea monster, menacing in appearance, but slow to act. When the crisis comes, Egypt will do nothing, causing Israel only shame and confusion. Number 5, woe to those who trust in horses and chariots. Isaiah's fifth woe is a still more vehement denunciation of those who trust in Egypt's horses and chariots and disregard the Holy One of Israel. Those who do forget that the Egyptians are but men and their horses flesh, and that mere flesh cannot avail in conflict in spirit. Eventually the Lord means to deliver Jerusalem. The children of Israel will but turn from their idolatries to him. Society will be regenerated. The renovation will begin at the top. Conscience will also be sharpened, and moral distinctions no longer confused. As Delitzsch puts it, the aristocracy of birth and wealth will be an aristocracy of character. The careless and indifferent women, too, in that day will no longer menace the social welfare of the state. The outpouring of the Lord's Spirit, an ideal commonwealth will emerge, in which social righteousness, peace, plenty, and security will abound. Number 6, woe to the Assyrian destroyer. Isaiah's last woe is directed against the treacherous spoiler himself, who's already laid waste to the cities of Judah and is now beginning to lay siege to Jerusalem. The prophet prays, and while he prays, behold, the mighty hosts of the Assyrians are routed, and the long besieged but now triumphant inhabitants of Jerusalem rush out like locusts upon the spoil that the vanishing adversary had been forced to leave behind. The destroyer's plan to reduce Jerusalem has come to nothing. The whole earth beholds the spectacle of Assyria's defeat and is filled with awe and amazement at the mighty work of the Lord. Only the righteous may henceforth dwell in Jerusalem. The eye shall behold the Messiah King in beauty, reigning no longer like Hezekiah over a limited and restricted territory, but over a land unbounded, whose inhabitants enjoy the Lord's peace and protection and are free from all sin, and therefore from all wickedness and sin. What a beautiful picture of this messianic future. The prophet's woes find an appropriate conclusion. Isaiah never pronounced a woe without adding a corresponding promise. In chapters 34 and 35, the prophet utters a fierce cry for justice against all the nations, but against Edom in particular. His tone is that of judgment. Edom is guilty of high crimes against Zion. Therefore, it is doomed to destruction. On the one hand, the scattered ones of Israel shall return from exile and obtain joy and gladness. Sorrowing shall flee away. Exodus 36 to 39 have history, prophecy, and song intermingled. These chapters serve both as an appendix to chapters 1 to 39 and as introduction to chapters 40 to 66. In them, 3 important historical events are narrated, in which Isaiah was a prominent factor. The double attempt of Sennacherib to obtain possession of Jerusalem, 36 and 37. Hezekiah's sickness and recovery, chapter 38. The coming of the embassy of Merodach-Baladan, chapter 39. With certain important omissions and insertions, these chapters are duplicated almost verbatim in 2 Kings 18 through 2019. They are introduced with a chronicle note in the 14th year of Hezekiah. Various attempts have been made to solve the mystery of the date. If the author is alluding to the siege of 701 BC, difficulty arises because that event occurred not at Hezekiah's 14th, but in his 26th year, according to the biblical chronology. Or if with some we date Hezekiah's accession to the throne of Judah 729, then the siege of 701 BC occurred in Hezekiah's 28th year. It is barely possible, of course, that the 14th year of King Hosea was the 14th year of the 15 years which were added to his life. But more probably, it alludes to the 14th year of his reign. On the whole, it is better to take the phrase as a general chronological caption for the entire section, with special reference to chapter 38, the story of Hezekiah's sickness, which actually fell in his 14th year. They're dating that at 714, which puts him around 729, 730, and I've been thinking 740. So I got some chronological stuff to do here. And which, coupled with Sargon's expected presence at Ashdod, was the great personal crisis of the king's life. Sennacherib made two attempts in 701 to reduce Jerusalem, one from Lachish with an army headed by Rabshakeh, 36:2 to 37:8, and another from Libnah with a threat conveyed by messengers, 37:9 to 13. The brief section contained in 2 Kings 18, 14 to 16, omitted from between verses 1 and 2 of Isaiah 36, because it was not the prophet's aim to recount the nation's humiliation. Isaiah's last word concerning Assyria, 37:21 to 35, is one of the prophet's greatest predictions. It is composed of three parts: a taunt song, an elegiac rhythm on the inevitability of the humiliation of Sennacherib, a short poem on a different rhythm directed to Hezekiah in order to encourage his faith, a definite prediction in less elevated style on the sure deliverance of Jerusalem. Isaiah's prediction was literally fulfilled. In 38:9 to 20 contains Hezekiah's song of thanksgiving, in which he celebrates his victory from mortal sickness. It is a beautiful, plaintive writing, omitted altogether by the author of the Book of Kings, 2 Kings 20. Hezekiah was sick in 714. 2 years later, Merodach-Baladan, the veteran archenemy of Assyria, having heard of his wonderful recovery, sent letters and a present to congratulate him. Doubtless also political motives prompted the recalcitrant Babylon. Be that as it may, Hezekiah was greatly flattered by the visit of Merodach-Baladan's envoys, and in a moment of weakness showed them all his treasures. This was an inexcusable blunder, as the sight of many precious possessions would naturally excite Babylonian cupidity to possess Jerusalem. But he announced with more than ordinary sight that the days were coming when all the accumulated resources of Jerusalem would be carried away to Babylon. Coming now to chapters wait, let's see here. There seems to be no real reason to doubt the genuineness of this prediction. Let's see here. Go back up a little. I missed something. Final prediction of judgment is the most marvelous of all Isaiah's minatory utterances, because he distinctly asserts that not the Assyrians, who were then at the height of power, but the Babylonians will be the instruments of divine judgment in consummating the destruction of Jerusalem. There seems to be no reason to doubt the genuineness of this prediction. It is indeed. We have a prophetic basis for chapters 40 to 66. Here's where the liberals choke. We're moving now to those chapters. Coming now to the chapters 40 to 66. We have the prophecies of comfort, salvation, and the future glory awaiting Israel. These chapters naturally fall into the three sections, chapters 40 to 48, announcing delivery from captivity through Cyrus. That's where they're going to choke there. 49 to 57, describing the sufferings of the servant of the Lord. This section ending like the former, with their refrain, there's no peace, saith my God, for the wicked. 3, chapters 58 to 66, announcing the abolition of all national distinctions and the future of the people of God. Chapter 60 is characteristic of this section, as 53 is of the second, and chapter 40 of the first. In greater detail, the first section, 40 to 48, demonstrates the deity of the Lord through his unique power to predict. That's worth just imbibing, getting off the exit on the interstate to ponder that. The basis of the comfort that the prophet announces is Israel's incomparable God. Israel's all-powerful Lord is incomparable. In the prologue, 41 to 11, he hears the four voices of grace, of prophecy, of faith, of evangelism. Then, after exalting the unique character of Israel's all but forgotten God, he exhorts the people not to suppose that the Lord is ignorant of or indifferent to Israel's misery. Israel must wait for salvation. They are clamoring for deliverance prematurely. Only wait, he repeats, for with such a God, Israel has no reasons to despair. In chapter 41, he declares that the supreme proof of the Lord's sole deity is his power to protect. He inquires, who stirred up one from the east? Though the hero is left unnamed, Cyrus is doubtless in the prophet's mind, 44:28, 45:1. He is not, however, already appearing on the horizon of history as some fancy, but rather predicted as sure to come. The verb tenses that express completed actions are perfects of certainty. They are used in precisely the same manner as those in 3:8, 5:13, 21:9. The answer to the inquiry is, I, the Lord, the first with the last, I am he. Israel is the Lord's servant. The dialogue continues. It is no longer between the Lord and the nations, as in verses 1 to 7, but between the Lord and the idols. Addressing the dumb idols, the Lord is presented as saying, predict something if you are real deities. As for myself, I'm going to rise up a hero from the north who will subdue all who oppose him. But I announce my purpose now in advance from the beginning, before time, before there's the slightest ground for thinking that such a hero exists or ever will exist, in order that the future may verify my prediction and prove my sole deity. I, the Lord, alone, of the future. In verses 25 to 29, the prophet even projects himself into the future and speaks from the standpoint of the fulfillment of the prediction. Thus, as we see above, was characteristic of Isaiah in chapters 24 to 27. And we will call it here as we continue our walk through Isaiah, a tremendous book. Let's do another verse. We're working our way through the hymnal. Thank we those, hymn 631, verse 2, thank we those who toiled in thought, many diverse scrolls completing, poets, prophets, scholars, saints, each a word from God repeating, till they came who told the story of the word and showed his glory. Let's pray. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb forever and ever. Amen. Till later, Godspeed, brothers and sisters.